Hi, I'm Laura Mize, pediatric speech-language pathologist, and welcome to my show, number 453, Expressive Language Milestones by 18 Months. Brought to you by my website, teachmetotalk. We're the largest online provider of ASHA-approved continuing education courses for therapists. Today, we're continuing our Language Milestone podcast series, and today is show number 4 of a 14-part series where we're looking at all the language milestones from about 12 months old or by 12 months old all the way up to 48 months. We'll be tackling these milestones in 6-month increments, and we'll have one show for expressive per age range and then one show for receptive. So in this course, like I said in the introduction, we are talking about expressive language milestones by 18 months. We are covering loads of material today, so if you don't usually purchase a handout, today might be a show that you want to do that for. This is a fantastic tool for therapists because you can certainly use it to guide your own goals when you're setting goals for children. You can use it as a parent education resource so that you're talking about with a parent about where their child is. And I love this handout because the directions and practically every word that I'm going to say will be right here on the handout. So be sure that you are checking that out. Purchasing the handout is also a fantastic way to support our work here at Teach Me to Talk. So if you are another professional or a parent or a grandparent and want to reach out and do that, we would certainly appreciate that. And you can find out links for those below here on YouTube, below the post here. And if you're listening to the podcast, this is show number 453, and you can get information about that, how to enroll, and how to get that handout at my website at Teach Me to Talk. And one last thing, if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, please do so. All right, so for parents tuning in to see how a child is doing, let's go ahead and review these milestones. And again, these are the ones that we want children to accomplish by the time they're 18 months. And again, remember, this is a list of typically developing milestones, and so I'm going to talk about that later versus our little language delayed friends and how we use this list. But let's go ahead and just talk about the milestones. And again, you can find this on your handout, so look at that right now. So the skills are, the first one is imitates play sounds and words frequently and spontaneously. So what does that mean? So little play sounds. If you were with me back in the previous show, 451, where we looked at language skills by 12 months, we talked about play sounds and what they are. So these are little words like exclamatory words like wow and whee and oh no, or woo, any little sound like that. Little sound effects, or things like animal sounds like moo and quack and ba ba ba, or things like vehicle noises, your motor sound, or vroom vroom, anything like that. So those little words plus familiar words, and we're going to talk about that a lot today. And then we had 2 other kind of qualitative measures there. It's frequently, so meaning not just occasionally, not just a few words here and there throughout the day, but a lot, and spontaneously. And what does that mean? That means on their own and not imitated. And so again, it means that they're imitating on their own without lots of direct cues. So that's what we're talking about here, because the whole milestone is imitation. So that was the first one. Secondly, and we'll talk about that a lot later as we go, but let's just keep going and get through this milestone list so we know what we're talking about today. The second milestone uses gestures to purposefully communicate. And remember what gestures are. These are little body movements that we use to convey a message. So when we point, we're essentially saying either look or I want that, or when we wave, we're saying bye-bye, or when we're clapping, we're expressing approval or excitement. So a child here, by 18 months, we want them using their gestures to purposefully communicate. And again, this is so important for kids before they learn words, because it tells us they're about to acquire words, because they're now symbolic thinkers, meaning that the gesture represents an idea that they want to say. And again, when they start to use these to purposefully communicate, we know that words are coming because they have the language capacity or the language skill and the cognitive skill to be able to know what those gestures mean and then to use those to communicate with you. All right, so the third milestone we'll be talking about today is combines gestures and vocalizations. And I love this skill. It's not on every developmental assessment. I'm talking too much in the intro. We'll get to it later, but it's a really important marker for looking at how a child, again, is developing language and what might be coming next after we start to see that milestone emerge. The fourth milestone we'll be discussing is names 5 to 7 familiar objects, and this gets really exciting for parents because now children are responding and really using their words in response when we ask them, what's this, or even when they're spontaneously naming it. So a wonderful, wonderful emerging skill that we see here in this age range. The next one is adds words to build spontaneous vocabulary. And this is when we know that a child is really going to be a talker. And so when a kid has more than a handful of words, we know again that language explosion is building. And we'll talk a lot about language explosion here in this developmental period. The next one is uses true words within jargon. And so jargon, that official definition is long, unintelligible strings of sounds. And so, whatever. I cannot model jargon as well as some other speech pathologists can. But it's a wonderful skill. And again, we'll talk about when we see that, what we anticipate will come next, and then what's happening when that can go and kind of turn atypical too. So we'll be discussing that. The next milestone is so fun, sings independently. So now you're finally going to get some feedback as a mom. You've been singing now for a year and a half to this sweet baby, and now he or she is going to try to sing back. So a great little milestone that we'll talk about. The next one is a real pragmatic function, meaning language use. So it's asks to have some needs met. So this is when a child starts to make some initial request. And this is contingent upon what? They have to have some words before they can really start to ask. Now, kids can do it with gestures and vocalizations, and that's fantastic. But here the milestone is that they're going to use some words to ask you to meet their needs. The next two kind of go hand in hand when we're looking at expressive language. There are two common things that children begin to say as they begin to talk, and lots of times it's just that they've heard this word and this little holistic phrase enough that now that they're beginning to use it. So it's asks for more, and that's specifically, using the word. We could count the sign here as well, or any kind of AAC. And let me just say, if a child is an AAC user, an augmentative alternative communication form, that could be signs, it could be gestures, it could be a picture system, it could be a device. We want to still give them credit for these skills because they are using the pragmatic function. And again, back when I said asked to have some needs met, let me clarify. I said that needs to be spoken. There, certainly anytime a child is using AAC, we want to still go ahead and give them credit for that skill. So I wanted to mention that. And then the last skill here turns a little bit technical. We talked about it back in show 451, but here we're going to bump it up a little bit more because remember, all of these milestones build upon one another. So a child usually meets the milestones, with typical development and even with a delay, they meet the milestones in one age range before they solidly meet the next ones. And we'll see kids with atypical development who have splinter skills, meaning that they're kind of all over the place. They might have a few skills at 12 to 18 months, but then they have some, but not all of them, maybe 3 or 4 on this list, and then they have 3 or 4 more in the 18 to 24 month range. And so again, there's some, and then maybe even some more up in 24 to 30. And will typically developing kids have some strengths and kind of get ahead in some things? Absolutely. But their bottom age ranges are all filled in, all mastered. And so that's the difference that we know with splinter skills. It's not that a kid might have, a skill way up here in the stratosphere. It's really when a kid has splinter skills, we're saying that they're missing some very foundational skills at earlier language levels. All right. So that was our entire list for 12 to 18 months with expressive language. Now, if you're wondering about the resource or the sources for these developmental milestones. I spent a lot of time talking about that back in shows 450 and 451. So go back and listen to those if you want that information. All right, let's begin with a reminder for our parents and professionals who are not speech-language pathologists about the definitions. Let's talk about the definitions for expressive language and receptive language. Now, expressive language, what we're talking about today, is what a kid expresses or says, and it means the child's words, but certainly can also be expressed through gestures, through body language, through even facial expressions like we talked about back in show 450. But expressive language is only one part of the communicative piece, and lots of times parents just think about communication as strictly what a child is able to convey or say, but that's not the entire picture. Receptive language plays such an important part with expressive language, and actually, if we think about it, expressive language is highly dependent upon receptive language. So what's receptive language? It's the input piece. It's the vocabulary that a child understands. So all the words that he or she comprehend and know what they mean. Many times the reasons that toddlers talk later is because they really don't understand words well enough to use words. And so that's certainly something that we as early intervention therapists need to always be cognizant of when we're talking with parents. And just because a parent says something like, he understands everything, you know that's not true, because you know what typical language development entails, and you know that even a typically developing, even a child who's doing well cognitively at 18 months does not understand everything. And so when a parent says that kind of thing, you know, you really want to take a step back. And that's not that, again, that children won't have some strengths and won't. Again, you know, typically developing toddlers always understand a lot more than they can say. But at the same time, parents routinely miss receptive language delays. And so we always have to be aware of that and always talk with parents about that. And anytime there's a receptive language delay, what do we automatically expect? We expect an expressive delay. And so if a child doesn't understand words, he's not going to be able to use those words to communicate. So that's what we really want to do when we're talking about with language delays with parents, is really explain both pieces of language development with expressive and receptive language so that they understand exactly where their child is functioning. And if that's the reason their child is not talking yet, you need to say that and you need to make that connection for them so that they get it. On the other hand, if a child has excellent receptive language skills for his or her age, you need to say that too, and you need to talk about what a strength that is for that child and how other kids with language delays might be in a different situation, and that can certainly help a parent feel a little bit better sometimes in that process. All right, so let's talk about 12 to 18 months. What a wonderful developmental period, right? So many things are happening here. And we talked about back in show 452 in the receptive language part that there's a receptive language explosion going on, primarily for typically developing babies at the beginning of this developmental period. And so we usually think about language explosions as purely expressive. When does a child start to say a lot? But we, as early intervention professionals who deal with this stuff all the time, we know something's got to come before that, and that's the receptive language piece. And so we talked about that a lot back in 452, that the receptive language explosion is what's really happening here at the beginning or really throughout this 12 to 18 month period. And then we'll see the expressive language piece start to explode toward the end of this phase and certainly into that next developmental period with 18 to 24 months. So here at the beginning of this period, we think about this happening. And again, we know with receptively, we have got to build that receptive language piece so that we can see all these wonderful skills that we're going to talk about today. All right, and let's talk for a second about our little friends with language delays and disorders. And I mentioned this in the beginning, but let's go ahead and talk about this now. We know that when we select goals for children, when we're working through therapy with what we want them to work on next, we typically use these milestones as a marker and as a way to specify what we know comes next with development. And when we are doing this, this means what? We are using what? A developmental approach, meaning that if we have a child who is nowhere near talking, and we know that because he hasn't met all those 11 pre-linguistic skills that we've talked about a lot here on the podcast and on the channel, and at my website at Teach Me to Talk. I've written a whole book about that too. Let's Talk About Talking, where you walk through those 11 skills. Our little guys, when they are nowhere near talking and communicating because they're missing so many of those pre-linguistic skills, we would not write a goal, or should not write a goal, using a developmental approach, a short-term goal that is, to be able to use words to communicate. Why? Because we know that there's too much ground to cover. Typically when we're, within the span of our plan, and even though a parent might have said on an IFSP or an overall IEP goal, which the therapist is writing, that's you, but we know that a parent might say something like uses words to communicate, and that's probably still your IEP goal, your long-term goal. But know that your short-term goals are going to come from these milestones. And again, therapists know this, but sometimes parents don't understand why we're reviewing the milestones, why we can't just say, this is what's going to happen, and let's just work on talking day one, minute one in speech therapy, the first time we see this kid, regardless of what he's doing. And so that's not really how language happens, and it's not how speech therapy should happen either. And so you want to be really, really specific about that when you, the therapist, are making these goals, so that you don't set that child up for failure or set him up for not meeting a goal that was unrealistic from the beginning. And so these milestones can really, really help you hone in on that. And when you think, gosh, it's going to be 6 months before this kid talks, it really is, because again, by where he is. Now, can kids kind of do double time and have good catch-up time? Absolutely. And that is another reason that we have kids be in therapy, so that we can push that timeline a little bit. But bottom line, kids have to meet these other skills on the way to be able to using skills at a higher level. So these again are, I want to mention the language explosion piece for a kid with language delays. He's not going to have it, probably his receptive language. Again, let's just say it like this. Let's say it more positively. He's not going to have his expressive language explosion until he's had his receptive language explosion. And so when you get a kid who's not understanding very much, you as that therapist better back off that expressive piece, because you are just treading water there. If you want to make a real difference, you got to speed that receptive language learning up. So, and let me say one more thing about age ranges. And again, it doesn't matter when a child meets these. If we know there's a language delay, don't get stuck on, he's still a year behind, he's still sick. You wouldn't probably not be too upset about a 6-month delay, but parents will get upset about that kind of thing, and you've got to kind of take that number piece out, especially if that's upsetting to them. They've got to know the information from the beginning, but just look at these as, again, a process and a continuum. When a child is moving through all these things. All right, with language acquisition. So let's begin with our first milestone, and this is a big one. We've got a lot of things to talk about here. So imitates play sounds and words frequently and spontaneously. And so again, we talked a lot about imitation and its importance back in show 451. And remember, we said, what did we say about imitation? And every time I'm talking about imitation, I say this line, and I get emails from therapists that are so sweet, and they say, I quote you all the time. I even sound a little bit Southern now because I've listened to you so much. But what do we say about imitation in every single show? We say imitation is how all of us learn everything. We copy what other people do, and we see and somebody do something, and then we try to do it ourselves. So there is a hierarchy or a method for teaching a child to imitate. We reviewed this back in 451, so if you want that longer explanation, go back and listen to that show. And actually, I've written a whole book about that too, about teaching imitation, and done tons of courses on it here on our YouTube channel. And if you'll look in our $5 and $10 CEU library, these courses are actually, there's a whole series about teaching imitation. It's show 422 to 429, and we walk through that whole process. And so if this is new information for you, or if this is the first time you've ever stumbled upon anything that I've done or any of my work, that's a fantastic place to start. And therapists are always saying, where should I start with all your stuff? You have a lot of things. That podcast series and looking at that imitation hierarchy will literally change your career. And so as we are sitting here talking about 12 to 18 months, look at those. Let's just go ahead and break that down. Just one quick little review, and I promise I'm not going to get stuck here and just keep on and on and on about it. But I do want to say that by 12 months, imitation is firmly established. And we know with typically developing children, a lot of these things they come in layer upon layer, but they move so quickly that you may not recognize it. But our little kids with language delays stay in each phase longer, or they may actually plateau or get stuck at a level, and we have to bump them up. And that's essentially what's happened when we have our little friends who are pretty good imitators of things that are nonverbal, but then they get to the imitating words piece, and they may say, or even sounds before that with exclamatory sounds and play words like we're talking about here in this milestone. They just get kind of stuck there and can't go any further. And so again, that's what we've got to do, is figure out where is that breakdown in imitation, and let me help them work through that hump so that they can get over that. So real quickly, let's just run through this little hierarchy. First, kids learn how to imitate non-verbally. So they imitate actions with objects, and then they also imitate a lot of body movements, or even facial expressions as it kind of moves up their body. And then they begin to imitate some non-verbal things that they do with their mouths, like clicking their tongues or blowing a raspberry, doing that kind of thing. Then they begin to imitate some vocalizations with that aren't necessarily words, but they're using their voices. So they may fake cough or fake sneeze or pant. They're directing that little airway, but it's not quite a word. And then kids begin to use kind of almost words. So those play sounds that can be spelled, so more like words, like the animal sounds that we talked about and the little exclamatory words. And then kids begin to imitate words that are directly tied to context. So verbal routines. So words like go, when you say ready, set, go, you know that word comes next, and a child begins to anticipate that too. And then after then is when kids really begin to imitate, and then spontaneously imitate, meaning that you don't have to cue them. You say the word and they know they're supposed to repeat it. They do that. And so that's that whole continuum of imitation. And so here in this developmental level, babies, again, really perfect and hone that skill of learning how to imitate. In fact, babies are such good imitators by this point. By the end of this developmental period, many typically developing babies are not only imitating familiar words all the time, they're starting to imitate some phrases. And so longer and longer pieces of speech that they can imitate. And so that's an exciting period. Now, for those of you who think that, oh, Laura, you have just lost your mind because using two-word phrases doesn't come in until the child is 24 months. Well, remember that we are talking about imitating at that point. And as we go through to the next show, between 18 and 24 months, we know that children do start to use a lot of phrases and combine their words on their own. So now they're starting to generate their own phrases. That comes next, but here in this period, before we get there, what do we say? Before they use it spontaneously, kids have to imitate it. So that's what we're talking about. And we're not going to get into imitating phrases today. We're way back at the beginning of this period, more like 12 to 13 months rather than all the way up at 18 months. But you get my point here. I also want to say, for those of you who are not speech-language pathologists and who haven't studied language development like we have, you may really get skewed in your perceptions of what typical language development is. And you may think, well, if a kid has this, they're supposed to be using 50 words and saying some phrases by 24 months, it's okay if they don't do it till 30 months. No, don't do that. Don't skew your own perceptions. And the other part of that is we never want to really prohibit a child from obtaining services when we can provide them when they meet the eligibility requirements, because we assess them correctly and because we have our own perceptions of typical development firmly in line, and we don't get skewed by the fact that we see kids with delays, and so then we start to think nobody talks till they're 2 or that kind of thing. So don't do that. Be sure that you are really thinking about these milestones. And again, that's one of the reasons that we're doing this series here. All right, so enough about the data, enough about the hierarchy. Let's talk about what we can do to increase imitation here. And remember, we're talking about play sounds and simple familiar words. I've done lots of podcasts about this, but this is kind of what I call the one slide version. And this is here on your handout too, a little walk through with this. But what do we do to get kids to really imitate? We already walked through that process, but first we model single words. So we use a lot of those words that are the target word, like if we want a child to learn how to say cookie. Cookies are his favorite snack, and so we think, oh, this is something he likes, this is a good target. I've heard him do a consonant at the back of his mouth. Let's try this sound, or let's try this word. And so cookie might be a word that you would target there. And so we would want to say the word cookie a lot. And so repetition is a real important factor here. When we're using words or using phrases and talking to a child, you don't start the sentence or the phrase with cookie either. You want to put the target word where? At the end. So that's the most salient word, the most important word, the word that the child notices most at the end of those phrases. So model those key single words frequently. That's your first strategy here to increase imitation. The second one is your body language. And so expectant waiting. And this is the kind of the pregnant pause, pardon me, where we lean forward. You might even do a little gasp like I just did then, which kind of got me choked up. I'm still suffering from all these allergies. And so that kind of tell me face sets the stage, and it's anticipatory. And so many times when we change our body language like that, we'll get so much more from a child. I was talking to a clinician earlier this week who was talking about that, and she's supervising a student right now, and she was saying it's amazing just how much these little tweaks that we can make, even when you're working with a student or with a mom, and you say, look, have you noticed that when I want him to say something, have you ever really thought about what I'm doing there and why it works sometimes and why it doesn't? And it's not always dependent on the kid. It's me. When I'm doing this, when I remember to give him all of his anticipatory cues, meaning I anticipate that he's what? Going to talk. So when I give him all those cues, he does it. And so you point that out to a mom and you tell her how to do it. Say, I want you to watch me here. Look what I'm doing. I'm leaning forward. I've got my eyes real big. I kind of do that little gasp, like I'm waiting. And so again, that's the second strategy. And this is kind of, we talk about that therapy is science, but it's also an art. So this would kind of be the art piece where it's how we do what we're doing. We're not just pausing and waiting. How are we doing that? And so with expectant waiting, we can get much, much better results and really increase, especially for the kids that just need that little extra motivation to try to want to bump it up and say it. And motivation is not the only reason that kids don't talk. Please don't misconstrue what I'm saying there. But at the same time, I want you to know that anticipation is big, and so do your expectant waiting. Third skill here to teach imitation, or to increase the likelihood that a child will imitate, is reward imitating. And this is particularly important for our friends who maybe are on the autism spectrum, or any kind of friend that imitating is super hard for them. And so we always want to start out with a natural reward, which means what? Give them what they want. Give them what they've asked for, or what you're setting up as your target there. The second kind of level of reinforcement there with rewarding imitating would be praise paired with physical contact. And so you're going to reach over and pat their little legs, or squeeze them, or give them a hug, or tickle, or do whatever they like, and you're saying, oh, you're doing so good. And eventually that verbal praise can kind of take the place of that. Sometimes kids are ready for that, but when it's super, super hard, ready for it just to be verbal praise. When it's super hard, and when a kid's not very motivated by you and doesn't really want to please you, like sometimes that happens where a kid's just not that into it. You have to, again, pair that physical contact with the verbal praise so that verbal praise becomes more meaningful. Now, for some kids, we've got to bump it up even more. We have to give a tangible reward. And so this would be the kid, I say we go all ABA on it. And that would mean with our approach then we're going to give a physical or a tangible something, physical meaning a physical actual piece of something, or a turn with a toy, but usually it's an edible. So a really small snack or something. And that's what our friends in ABA really, really perfected with that continuous reinforcement cycle, so that a child becomes first of all, he gets more and more practice, which we as SLPs know that's going to drive that motor process, and we want that moving along. But also just from an intrinsic motivation point, they want to keep working for that payoff that they get. And so for some of our kids, we really do have to do that at the beginning. Once a child is imitating pretty well, then we break out choices. And I don't just mean, do you want to play bubbles or balls? I mean, you have to do 20 choices during that whole little routine. And so if you were picking bubbles, if the child picked bubbles, and then, should I leave the top on or take it off? And then, okay, after you've got the top off, oh my goodness, the wand, should I leave it in or take it out? Then he has to imitate out. Oh, where do you want me to blow the bubbles? Or what should I do? Should I stop or should I blow? And again, that keyword, try to put your keyword, if they're new imitators, at the end. At the beginning of the word, at the beginning of that little choice is going to be hard, but that's the only way that you know a kid really understands it either. But at the beginning, when you're working on kids at this level, when you're just trying to get them to imitate anything, stick with your keywords at the end. You don't want to make a echolalic, though, where everything is I repeat the last phrase, but the last word I hear in the phrase. That is kind of normal, but at the same time, we want their receptive language to kick in so that they understand what they're saying and don't just say the last thing you said. After choices, once we have given those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of choices with the child, and again, I'm not talking about over the course of 6 months. I'm talking about in a day or two. You should have given a child over 100 choices. His imitations are going to become spontaneous. It gets to the point where you start to say, bubble or ball, and then he's automatically going to pick. You're not going to have to sit there and really cue and cue and cue. Or imitations become spontaneous in the way that you say, oh, let's play cars. And he says, cars. And you say, oh, look, I've got the car. We're going to make it go. And he says, go. And so then where he, again, is spontaneously imitating often, and that's where we want to get here, and that's what we want to do by the end of this developmental period. So if a child can't imitate words, what do we do then? Back down to those easier, earlier levels of imitation. I'm not going to walk through that hierarchy again, but if they can't do words, they need to do play sounds. If they can't do play sounds, they need to do what? Body movements and gestures. If they can't do body movements and gestures, what do they need to do? Imitating other nonverbal things like actions with objects. So again, back them down. Anytime a kid can't meet the goal, it's because it's what? It's too hard. So you've got to make it easier. We discussed that a lot in 451. So if you need more information about teaching imitation, go back and look at that show, watch that show, or that entire podcast series about imitation, and that shows 422 through 429. All right, let's move on to this second milestone here. Uses gestures to purposefully communicate. And we said by 12 months, children are beginning to imitate not only sounds, but gestures too. And so remember, gestures are the way that we share messages through our body movements. And toddlers really perfect, like we said with imitation, they're perfecting imitation throughout this developmental period. Same thing with gestures. And Dr. Amy Weatherby says that kids need to use 16 gestures by 16 months. And then again, not only for the gestural development, because that's so communicative when we actually use gestures throughout our entire lives. You've seen me here on the podcast. I can't even open my mouth without moving my hands too, right? So super important. But the other thing that's happening is we're really supporting their cognitive development and their capacity to learn language. And so the milestones there with looking at, they've become symbolic. They are learning how, again, just increasing, not just one or two little gestures, but they have, over a dozen gestures. And so that's what we want to be able to do. Back in show 451, we took a long list of gestures that we had. Among them, reaching up to be picked up, clapping, waving, pointing, blowing kisses, turning away in protest, or sometimes with the hand, shaking their little heads no or yes. It's usually no first, right? Leading a parent to what they want, or tapping or patting for attention. Those are some of the gestures that we see kids begin to use purposefully to communicate in this period. So they're not really imitating you all the time anymore. They don't necessarily have to see you wave bye-bye before they wave bye-bye. It's become meaningful. They can do it on their own. Sometimes in therapy we see that, right? A kid, we're doing something kind of hard. They've been there a while. It's toward the end of the session, and they just sit back and kind of start waving at you. And that tells you what? Like, I am out of here. I am finished. I have got to go. This is enough. And so again, they start to use those gestures on their own. Kids who can use gestures are in a much better position to communicate than children who don't. They are much easier for adults around them to understand, and so they get their needs met more often, and they're less frustrated. So many of our little guys with speech language delays actually learn to use gestures very, very well to compensate for their lack of words, and we actually want to promote that. And like we talked about back in the introduction, gestures precede words in language development, so we always want to make sure we're paying attention to that. So if you are a pediatric speech language pathologist or a developmental interventionist or specialist, whatever they call you in your state, you teacher people, you've really got to think about that. If you are just going straight for words and not really paying attention to gestures and not incorporating a lot of gestures in your treatment sessions, you want to do that, and you want to start to make sure that you are modeling that so effectively that parents get it, and you talk to them about it too. You not only show them what to do, you tell them what to do, and you say, hey, we've got to really get these gestures going and really, really pump these up, because we know that gestures come just before words start to emerge. So let's help this along here and get some of these gestures going. The other great thing about gestures in this period is that early gestures turn into words. And so kids start to be able to vocalize and then approximate a word as they're using the gesture. So before they've just maybe waved bye-bye, but now they actually try to say bye-bye. Before they might have clapped with you, but now they're saying what? Yay! Because they've heard you say that probably thousands of times, right? When their nose is snarled, when they don't like a food, or when, say, they have a stinky diaper, that turns into what? Ooh! They put that little vocalization with it. Shaking their little finger, and their head becomes what? No, 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 right? And so lots of those early words develop with the gestures that a child is using. So again, how do we work on it? We model gestures all day long. We use the tell him, show him, help him approach that we talked about back with receptive language in show 452. And so we use the gesture, we're using our vocalization with it, and then if he doesn't do it, what should you do? You should reach out and help him do it. So take his little hand and help him use that gesture. You cannot make a kid talk, but you can help them gesture, and that's so important, and really help parents understand that. If you can't get imitation going with gestures, you've got to back up to hand motions with songs. And so think about things like If You're Happy and You Know It, or even Itsy Bitsy Spider, or Patty Cake, or anything like that, where they are imitating those hand motions. And again, If You're Happy and You Know It, that just sets it up so beautifully to teach that imitation. And parents love practicing that way because it provides so much structure for them. They know what to do next. They know that song, and that's a lot easier than saying something like play imitation games. So they get that. So that's certainly a strategy and an activity that we want to recommend to help children learn how to do gestures and imitate nonverbal body movements. All right, let's move on and talk about the next milestone, which is combines gestures and vocalizations. And remember what I said about this before in the introduction. This is not always on the test, but we love it as SLPs because it's just such a nice next step for kids, because they've learned how to gesture and they've learned how to vocalize, and we put them together and they're doing it. It's like a Reese's peanut butter cup, right? You've got the peanut butter and the chocolate, and here it comes together and makes something beautiful. And that's how we feel about kids who are learning how to do that. And so way before kids begin to use word combinations, they're usually combining a gesture with a word or a vocalization. And so that's certainly something that we want to promote and that we want to come in, because it tells us that cognitively they can join two ideas, and they will never get to the point that they can meaningfully and spontaneously generate their own phrases with picking this word out of my word bank and this word out of my word bank that mommy has not just said, but I can join them together on my own. They're not going to be able to do that with phrases until they've done some of these other things first. And so let me give you an example. At the beginning, when a child is combining vocalizations and gestures. And this might be, right around 12 months. When he wants something, and this is something classic that we see in speech therapy with our older kids who can't talk, but they can do this. They reach for something and they say, right? They're telling you, I want that. They're reaching for it. Their reach may not, it's a gross approximation of a point, right? We want them pointing. Pointing would be the higher level thing there. And then the we want it to turn into a word. I want that, or a phrase, or a holistic phrase, or ball, or whatever, truck, whatever they're reaching for. So that happens early in this developmental period. And then by the time they get further along, it becomes more complex. So like we said, the reach becomes the point. I've got this cute story from our little grandbaby Henry, who's now 13 months old. And our daughter told me that, we talk about his language development, all day, every day. It's one of our main topics, as you can imagine. And getting to, be a grandmother, but a language professional with my daughter, who's also a language professional, that's been really, really exciting for us. And such a great reminder of typical development. And so when Henry's dad came in the room, he looked at him. Macy said she was holding him, and he looked at him, and then he said, "Dada," and John said, "What?" And he pointed to the fridge and said, "Baba." And Macy was excited, and they were both so excited about that because that is so complex. He said his name, and then he combined the point with the word approximation for bottle. And so that is a fantastic representation of the kind of thing that we want to see happen throughout this period. So how can we get this going? You've just got to model it. You've got to really consciously point and talk. When you're reaching for something, use your gimme fingers there. When you're shaking your head no, add that finger too and say the little word that you want him to repeat. When a kid can't find something, you say, "Where'd it go? Where? And you're using your body language and you're using your facial expressions. And again, you're pairing those early words or even little holistic phrases. A lot of times kids will say, what? Go. They start with the part that's at the end. When you're calling mama, like we talked about for the mama game back in the by 12 months section, or those two shows there, using that little gesture, putting your hands up by your mouth, all of these things facilitate it. Sometimes our little guys with motor planning issues actually do better with popping out the word when you pair a motor movement with it, because you've really just facilitated that additional motor plan for that word by using your motor action with it. And so when you begin this, you'll see an increase in gestures. A kid will begin to use a lot more gestures. If you don't, what's the specific problem? Is it a physical motor problem? So is there a strength problem? Is there a coordination problem? Is there paralysis with our kids, maybe who have had CVAs in utero, or, CVAs shortly after birth, or, a bleed because of prematurity? That could really happen. So you've got to take that into consideration too. Those kids can't use their bodies as well. And so even if their cognitive receptive language piece is moving along, there still might be a problem with using gestures because of their body movement. So that's why we have OT and PT, right? So that would certainly be something that, that's the piece that you can tease out. Is there a cognitive problem? Are they having difficulty linking meaning with gestures? Do they just not get it? And so again, we know that we're going to build their cognitive skills. And how do we do that? We go back to that previous developmental period. We make sure they've mastered those 3 big cognitive milestones with object permanence, cause and effect, and simple problem solving. That's how we know, well, I know this is a cognitive skill he can't do. The cognitive skills here in this period that we talked about back in show 452, is he demonstrating functional use of objects? Oh, no, that's not. So that tells you, gosh, there's a cognitive problem here. Might be a social problem. Our little friends with autism don't watch other people sometimes well enough to imitate their actions and imitate their gestures. They also have great difficulty with nonverbal communication. That's one of the diagnostic criteria or characteristics of autism, right? And so again, tease out what the problem is. Why aren't they doing this? And really, when you isolate what you think the problem is, you're much, much closer to a solution. All right, the next milestone is names 5 to 7 familiar objects. Now, this one is so important because we begin to know once and for all that a child is indeed learning language. So that when you say cup and they say ka, you think, hallelujah, they've done it. Or then here where we start to say, what's that? And they say, cup or ka. Without the model, again, you feel like the heavens have just opened up and the angels are singing. This child will really talk, right? So it's such an exciting time for us as therapists and as parents. So vocabularies of new talkers consist mostly of nouns. And so again, that's what we're talking about here. Names of things, favorite things. The only way to work on this goal is to be sure kids hear it and hear it and hear it and hear it and hear it. And then that we're encouraging imitation. So you've got to model these object names very deliberately as you show a child the item. You can't just start with what's that, what's this. You've got to really be sure that you are intentionally being very, very, very purposeful and direct about this goal. Now, while most parents will naturally label objects in their home without being told to do that, particularly when they're worried about language, it's so important that you make them understand that their performance, their child's performance is directly related to their performance here. Now, am I saying that when a child is not talking that it's just because the parent has not talked to him? No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying if a parent is not talking to him and labeling, he doesn't have a shot. So make sure that parents really understand what they should be doing. Help parents pick really specific target words to work on when you're at this developmental level. And so again, these are not that you take a vocabulary list like one that's here on page 3 of your handout. I've given you a good list, but you figure out what words are important in that child's daily routines. If he never eats an apple, which he probably, if it's, he's probably not, right? That's a harder consistency. And so why parents probably, a choking risk, they're probably not going to give that to him yet. Probably not until he has a lot of teeth. And so why would you teach the word apple, right? And so you've got to be really, really direct with parents about this too, because so many times they'll just resort to like taking down the ABC book and looking at the pictures and, beginning with things that, again, airplane. How often is a child going to see an airplane unless he has a toy right there or lives close to the airport or somehow travels a lot and actually sees the plane as he's in the airport? They're real purposeful about that. That's not really functional. And so keep those words really functional. You've also got to talk about consistency and repetition. And so it's not just that mom every night is going to say the word duck to her child when he's taking a bath. She can't just say it a few times. She's got to say it like 25, 30, 50 times during that bath time so that a child really has an opportunity to be able to imitate. And so make some lists with parents. Say, at meals, what do you think the key words that you should work on? Cup, milk, more. And so more, again, not a great example here because we're talking about naming familiar objects. But you get my point. What are the words that a child is using frequently or the objects that a child is using frequently that we want him to be able to use frequently? So let's tie this milestone with receptive language development and play skills for a minute. Remember, we talked about the big cognitive things that are coming in that we mentioned back in show 452. Remember, we said that kids were going to demonstrate functional use of objects, and then we said that they are going to imitate actions during play. So this sets you up so well to work on expressive language and naming familiar objects here at this developmental level because you can use what's naturally coming in receptively. And again, this is how all of this ties in and really, really meshes together. So when you were playing with something like a baby doll, you're labeling, you're saying, baby, let's play with the baby. Oh, what can we do with the baby? Oh, see the baby? Oh, look, she's hungry. She's hungry. Let's eat, baby. Come on, baby. So your keyword there, baby, you've repeated it over and over and over and over. And then eventually you're going to be able to say, oh, look, what's that? And you want a child to say baby. And again, you might have some direct imitations, or you will in between there. Oh, here's a baby. Tell me baby. Say baby. Those kinds of things before you're going to start to hear those spontaneous labels. But you'll get there. And my point is you've got to set the stage and you've got to label. After a while, you do begin to ask, what's that? You cue a child to name the object. And again, so we label so they can imitate. We give the direct cues to imitate and say the word. And here's what I do if a kid is still really having trouble doing this. And again, this is not so much for a typically developing baby. If you've tuned in to kind of get some tips to tune up your own parenting here with your child who's chronologically at this developmental period, this might not be a technique that works as well as it does for us when kids are a little older and we're still working at this language level. And so you ask, what's that, when you have something, and then you wait a minute, and then you give them the carrier phrase, and you say, it's whatever the thing is. You don't want to stick with the it's forever, so that the child, I had a child one time that labeled everything that way with Santa, something that didn't make sense. She would say, what's this? And he would say, it's a Santa, instead of just kind of using his name. That would be weird if he said it's Mark, if a child's name is Mark, if you think about the kind of that 1-to-1 ratio with that analogy there. So when you do that, that carrier phrase, what's that? It's and again, you're doing that expectant waiting so that a child begins to pop out and use that word and name that object spontaneously. You fill it in if he doesn't. And so again, let me model it a little bit better because I think I botched it a little bit. And so you're playing, and let's use the word bowl. Let's say you're playing with that same baby doll and you've got the bowl there. And so, you've played with the bowl and you've labeled it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so she's imitated a little, a lot, and a little bit at the beginning and then more and more and more. And so you think, oh, she's ready to spontaneously name this. And so you say, oh, what's that? And if she doesn't imitate, you say, what's that? Tell me. It's and that's how you would do it. And so again, keep those little pauses in there. Give her, you're probably going to want to wait even longer than I did there. I get nervous sometimes when I'm modeling these examples, even after, all these years. But you get my point here. You've got to wait. You've got to give the child time to respond. But that carrier phrase, it's that's set it up. That's set it up for her to jump in there and fill in that word. Vary your carrier phrase. It's that's I see, I have, there's a. You don't want to facilitate an echoic sounding answer. And our friends in ABA, I'm not slamming them, but sometimes they do not model enough variety so that a child with autism doesn't sound so robotic. And sometimes our little friends with autism do that anyway. You've done a great job. They've just kind of latched onto a little phrase. And so it's not always the adult's fault, quote unquote, but at the same time, we can help that when we vary our carrier phrase. But it ties in. It's a super effective technique, and I hope that works well for you. Let's move on and talk about the next milestone. Adds words to build spontaneous vocabulary. And this is when we know that a child is on their way to talking, and we know that that language explosion is building. So let's look at some data here. The time-tested standard that we're using is that for expressive language, by 18 months, kids should use 50 words. And you may have bumped that up to 24 months. And again, that's giving all that time for that whole range of typical development. Not every kid is going to hit those, even without a delay. Typically developing kids, there's a big range of normal. And so when we're looking at standards here, we look at what the child is doing who's at the 50th percentile, so the average kid. And so the average 18-month-old has 50 words. That also means that the other part of typical development, down to where we think about the delayed level at whatever percentage, just off the top of your head, 5%, at the the last, our little friends, are scoring in that bottom 5%. So that other 45% down there won't have 50 words by 18 months, but that's still the standard. Dr. Rossetti says 15 words by 18 months. That's kind of our outlier for what's normal. So I think about that 18-month range, true typical development between 15 and 50 words. The truth is, some 18-month-olds have more words than that. They really do. And so if you are a therapist who's lost touch with normal, you might need to go out and do some volunteer work or do something where you can keep your memory alive with 2-year-olds that really do talk and 18-month-olds that really talk. All right, there's a vocabulary list on page 3 of your handout. We already talked about that most of our early talkers, their vocabularies consist mostly of nouns, but we also have these other parts of speech on here. And nouns, again, names of their favorite things, also other names for things that are really, really common. Once children master those, we are going to add some other parts of speech, but here at this period, we're really, really focused on those nouns. So we always want to choose words. If we're choosing targets for our little friends in speech therapy, we can look at a list like this, but we always want to consider what's familiar to them. Like we said, we want it to be totally functional, what's easy to say, and then more importantly, we accept a kid's approximation of a word. If they love cheese and they're just saying E for cheese, that is fine. If they say duh for dog, all right, the vowel's a little bit messed up, but who cares, right? You know what they mean. They've got that initial D. So talk to parents about that. Talk about how they can teach more and more and more nouns. Talk about those other word classes too, social words, early verbs, and prepositions. We do want those coming in, particularly as we head towards 16, 17, 18 months, because we do want kids having a big enough vocabulary or word bank to be able to combine those words into phrases here at the 18-month level. We're not going to talk about that in this show. We're going to put that off to the next show when we're looking at 18 to 24 months, but we'll talk about that a lot next time. All right, so let's move on and use this true words within jargon. So many toddlers use prolific jargon during this developmental period. True words within this tell us two things. One, they're really learning language, and two, they get that they're supposed to talk in longer utterances, but they don't have the vocabulary yet. But we like the fact that their combinations are already there, their sound combinations. We don't worry about apraxia when we hear a kid doing a lot of jargon. Apraxia is not the problem. They can already combine sounds. So anytime that you're hearing a lot of that, you know that apraxia is not the diagnosis for that child. So jargon, let's talk about jargon too. Jargon, again, can be completely typical, but jargon is also an atypical indicator once a child turns 2, particularly if he's not using any recognizable words. It's just jargon. And then we know that that child is developing speech, but the language part is missing. He needs the vocabulary. It could be that it really is a speech sound issue, that he's just not getting the right words in the right places, but you probably should already be recognizing words by 2, and if that's not happening, we know that that's usually associated with a receptive language problem. Again, it's a vocabulary problem, and so many times, I had a parent, and I tell this story in Teach Me to Talk, the therapy manual. This is where all of the information from this show originates in this manual, and we'll talk about it at the end and what a great resource that is for you. But this story, and this happened really early in my career, this little guy used jargon all the time, and I really was focusing on single words, and I could never get him to imitate a single word. This was well before I developed that imitation hierarchy, and again, really early in my career. And so I just was kind of frustrated with him and still didn't understand why things were moving along. And this mom, when we were at an IFSP meeting, never addressed this with me in one-on-one in sessions, but she said in front of this little boy's team, I don't understand why you keep trying to get him to say words when he's so obviously saying sentences. And so as a new therapist, that just was the first time I'd really thought about that. That mom really thought he was talking in sentences. And she really thought that all the words were meaningful but unintelligible. And so that meant that I had not done a good enough job explaining jargon. And I had not said, hey, we've got a big receptive language problem here, and he can talk, but he doesn't know what words mean yet. He's hardly following any directions. And so I had not done a good job of educating her with how language development occurs, even when it's atypical. Now, this little guy did go on to be diagnosed with autism. And this was, I think this was still in the 90s, when autism really, really exploded. But at the same time, I learned such a big lesson there that we always really have to talk to parents about exactly what's happening with their child and then tie it to why you're working on what you're working on. And so we were sticking to single words because, one, I wanted him to imitate single words, but even more importantly than that, I wanted him to understand single words and link that meaning. And so you've got to really, really talk about that with parents. With our expressive goal here, with what we're talking about here, with adding words to build spontaneous vocabulary, is still one word at a time. Now, toddlers can begin to use some holistic phrases here. and they're usually Gestalt learners, meaning they learn everything in chunks. So things like, I did it, I got it, where'd it go? Come on, what's that? But generally that's toward the end of this period, and so we'll spend a lot of time talking about that in 455. 2 shows from now, where we're going to talk about expressive language 18 to 24 months. Let's move on and talk about sings independently, and these last little milestones are pretty quick and pretty self-explanatory. So I want to just talk to you about how to facilitate these. So sings independently. Like we said before, by 12 months, kids are usually trying to sing, and during this phase, it's so wonderful because the child tries to begin to sing on their own. So in order to sing a song, a child has to what? Hear the song over and over and over, often enough to remember. So do you have favorites that you regularly sing in your therapy sessions or that are tied to everyday routines with your own child? You should. And if that's something you're not doing already, get that going today. And let me give you an even more effective way to use music. This is with what's similar to the technique that we talked about back a milestone or 2 ago when we were saying names 5 to 7 familiar objects. That's where we kind of set it up with a phrase so that the child is going to be able to fill in the last word. And so that's what verbal routines are. And we do this here with songs. And so you're singing something like the end of Ring Around the Rosies, where you're saying, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And we want the kid to fill in that word. And so use songs here in that way to set it up. Maybe a parent has sung Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to that little girl every night. That's one of their bedtime routines. And so eventually mom should start to pause. She should sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little, and then wait and see if her little girl will fill in star. Now, is star an easy word to say? No, but she could say ah, she could say ta, da, whatever her little version of that is, that's fine. And again, word approximations are our friend here because we want to start with something that we can work with. Let's talk about what to do if a child hates music, covers his ears anytime he hears you sing. Every time I talk about this, I kind of say the same thing. It's not you. These are auditory sensitivities. And so that child, again, it kind of, you're singing, anybody singing, you know, a pop star could be singing and it would, to that child, be like fingernails scraping down a chalkboard, right? They just have those sensitivities there. So when that happens, we don't stop singing. Do not stop singing. At the beginning, you might make singing more like chanting. And so it's, instead of singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, you're doing something more like Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. And again, that will help a lot of children tolerate that singing and become more and more comfortable with that, but still keep singing because kids need to build up their tolerance for that. Guess what preschool teachers do all day long? They sing, sing, sing. And so even in a developmental classroom, even in a special ed preschool classroom, teachers are going to sing. And so you want to help our little friends move toward that. I have had so much success with helping little friends who at the beginning just, were in the corner with their hands over their ears or screaming. Again, you don't want to keep causing that big response, but at the same time, you've got to work them toward being able to tolerate that. All right, the next milestone is a pragmatic one, meaning language use, so asks to have some needs met. So by 12 to 15 months, babies with typically developing speech will really begin to request some items with words or with signs or with pictures, whatever they're using. And usually, again, in typical development, we are focused on words. But I gave you that example before with my sweet grandbaby who did his whole dada point with the baba. That's asking to have a need met. You've got to build vocabulary so that a child has the word first. If you've never heard him imitate the word as a label, he is not going to be able to use that word as a request because labels typically come first, all right? Maybe not in every situation, but certainly imitated. We would have seen the child imitate it. And again, that's one of the, I like to say there are two things that have to happen before a child is going to ask to have some needs met. He's got to have receptive identification of that object, so he's got to know the word, and he's got to have imitated the word. over and over and over. You're not going to hear a word just out of the blue that a child has not imitated, particularly if he has a delay. That probably happens more in typical language development when a child is just spontaneously imitating all the time. But when there's a delay, we know that before a child really uses words spontaneously, we're going to have to hear them imitated for a while first. Let me say one other thing. They also have to have communicative intent here, meaning that they have to know that they can ask you for something. And again, that doesn't happen just when they pop out words. It happens first with gestures. It happens first by reaching and pointing and in other ways showing you that they want it. So when a child isn't doing this, we have to create some opportunities for a child to ask for what he wants. So you set up the situation so that he's more likely to want to request it. So you do it's not, well, let me just say this. It's not as easy to set this up when a child is in this chronological period, because again, they don't have the benefit of a little more miles under their belt. So this technique that we're going to talk about may work a little bit better with kids with language delays, but we'll talk about it here. Well, let's say this first. Usually here, lots of times to get a kid to ask for what they want, you just have to show it to them and do some like little teasing or like, I wonder what you want, that kind of thing, where you're really, again, just creating that opportunity and so that you get their bottle and you just wait for them to say bye-bye, or their cup or their toy that they like. Let's say it's their bear, and you know that they can say bear, and they say buh for that. And so you have their bear, and you're just kind of standing there and waiting for them to say it. So the therapist in you will naturally begin to cue after this to facilitate a request. And so again, we do say things like, oh, your bear, I've got your bear. Oh, look what I have. And so some parents, again, might just make it simpler and just say bear, tell me bear, and that's okay too. But eventually, you want your child to be able to ask you. You can also do some gentle withholding. And so what do I mean by that? Gentle withholding means that you're going to keep it back until they say the word, but if they don't say the word, you're going to give it to them anyway. And so we know that we always cue or provide how many cues? If you've listened to any of my work, you should know this. 3 to 5 times. We're going to cue that word 3 to 5 times. So with bear, we're saying, oh my goodness, look what I have. That might be, here we probably would go ahead and that would be trying to give a spontaneous word. But here, if they haven't done it with that, you're going to go ahead and cue the word. Oh, look, I have your bear. That's 1 time. Oh my goodness, here's bear. That's 2 times. Oh, I bet you want this. Are you going to tell me? That would be 3 or 4 cues right there. And so use that gentle withholding. If they don't do it, give it to them anyway. Not worth the power struggle. We'll talk about this a lot in the next show. This is referred to as communication temptations or environmental sabotage. So effective in getting kids to learn how to use words spontaneously, but we'll talk about that next time. The next 2 milestones are real specific things, and we paired them together in the introduction. So this is ask for more and ask what's that. So the word more, or actually the sign more, gets a bad rap from a lot of early intervention speech language pathologists, but not from me. Because it's on this developmental test, is the developmental skill. Dr. Rossetti thought it was important enough to include, and there are lots of other assessments that use that as well, so I teach that. The problem is because there was some research generated that said kids with autism sometimes overgeneralize and use the sign or word more for everything. And so many therapists then stop teaching it, not just to our kids with autism or at risk for autism, but everybody. Don't do that. More is such a functional word. The problem when kids get stuck with a word like more or a sign like more is really with the adults. The adults do not move along fast enough and often enough to help a kid develop more specific vocabulary. And so you've got to be sure that you are doing that. Signing the word more is a game changer for lots of kids and lots of families when they first begin speech therapy. I still try to teach it on day 1 if a kid has the prerequisite skills for signing, meaning that he or she is using some other gestures and they can imitate some body movements. Don't bother teaching a sign until you've seen evidence that they can do those things, because you're not going to be as successful. But if they can, more is an easy one to get going. All right, the next milestone asks, what's that? We talked about this already back when we were talking about naming familiar objects. And so again, I love this little milestone. I do not admittedly work on this often enough with my little friends, but it is a typically developing milestone, and it is a holistic phrase. So kids at this developmental level do not understand that what and that are separate words. They know that it kind of goes together, so it's the whole thing. That's why we call it, and they say it together. It's a holistic phrase that they've learned as one word, but they're asking for information, as in, what am I seeing there? In reality, we know what are they doing? They're imitating what they've heard their parents ask them all day, every day, because the parents are so delighted that this child is learning to talk. And so they're working on it all the time. And so their parents literally ask them, what's that? Over and over and over and over. And so very effective technique. And that's what we as therapists, certainly will do that. But then we've got to really facilitate the emergence of that too. And so you can work on this just in play by asking what's that. You can be real purposeful about it and get yourself a little bag of toys and pull out the first one and make a big deal about what's that, and really emphasize that to the point that that a child is going to want to start to imitate your phrase there too. Okay, so be sure that you go back and with what's that though, we still again don't want to make kids echolalic when they're doing that. You want to work on it, but not to the point that they don't get to the naming. You still want them naming that object. You don't want them just stuck there at that question. The last milestone here is uses a variety of consonant sounds in words. We talked about this a lot back in 451. The biggest thing that we're going to say here is that speech sounds develop along a continuum too, but we do not panic with a typically developing toddler who between 12 and 18 months is not correctly articulating every single sound in every single word. Our point here is, the milestone is just that we want to see the emergence of these consonant sounds. Now, Dr. Rossetti says that by 15 to 18 months, a baby will frequently include the sounds from the first, by 12 months, which were B, M, and G. So a sound at the front of a consonant at the front, a nasal sound, and then an approximation of a consonant at the back of their throat. So really gross use of these consonants. So then they're going to refine a little bit. So we'll start to hear some middle of the mouth consonants by 15 to 18 months. So that would be T and D and N. And N is also a middle of the mouth sound because, and I'm calling it that's an alveolar sound for those of you who are speech language pathologists. We call it that because the child's point of articulation, his tongue there, is going to elevate and touch his alveolar ridge. And so T's and D's are the consonants that we hear there. T, the unvoiced version, and D, the voiced version. And then N made at the same place in the mouth, but it's also a nasal sound. And then H. And so that, again, is a glottal sound, so a and so those are the consonant sounds that we start to hear in word attempts. So much research about that, but let me just say this is still really too early for goals per se, even if the child is chronologically older. Let's say that you have a 2-year-old, a 2.5-year-old who's working back at this 12 to 18 month level, and face it, that's where we get most of our little guys when they're referred for speech therapy, right here at this 12-month level. It's still too early for you to be writing specific consonant sound goals for kids. All we want to do here is just facilitate that emergence, and so get those vocalizations going. Here it's really diagnostic. It's how we have to use this. We think, these consonants are not developing yet. We could have a speech problem on our hands. It could be just a delay. The sounds are later coming in, but it could be more disordered. It could be apraxia, and we know that children are not with apraxia have limited consonant use. I don't have my newest therapy manuals over here, but back in August, a few months ago, I just released the apraxia workbooks 1 and 2. And the research is overwhelming that lack of consonant development is one of the early markers for apraxia. And again, what do we do to work on that here? We're just watching. We're facilitating that. we're going to see what's going to happen because the child needs more words. If this continues to be a problem, we know that we're going to kick in with those motor learning principles. And again, you can find, we're not going to talk about that today. You can find out about that in the Apraxia Workbooks 1 and 2. I just wanted to mention that here, so many times we're focused on language, as we should be. But you'll know, gosh, there's a chance here for a speech issue too. It may be dysarthria, meaning that a child has an overall motor issue, a muscle tone difference in his or her little body. That's not apraxia, that's dysarthria. Still a speech problem. We know, gosh, those consonants may be later coming in. It could be a phonological disorder, meaning, and that's the speech sound diagnosis that goes with the language disorder, language delay too, right? And so that's just the speech part of that. Not only is their language delayed or disordered, really is what we're talking about, their speech sound systems are also disordered. So there's kind of the whole kit and caboodle is the problem there. And so again, this is just diagnostic information. We aren't going to work on it yet. It's way too soon, especially with a child who's still within this chronological period, 12 to 18 months. But even in the developmental period, we know as an early intervention professional, we need to emphasize language before we worry about speech. So that's my point with that. All right, that's the end of our milestone list. Again, if you want this information in written form, please get the handout. That link is below. I mentioned this book earlier, but the best resource for teaching all these skills is my therapy manual, Teach Me to Talk, the therapy manual. What a name, right? And so it lists all the milestones that we're reviewing in this whole series of 14 podcasts. And so you can get not only the little handout here, but if you need the more specific directions, this manual will help you. I also mentioned Let's Talk About Talking. And this is the manual that we use when children are missing so many of the pre-linguistic skills. And how do we know they're missing their pre-linguistic skills? Because they have trouble with meeting nearly every milestone on this list. So many holes on that child's development, and you're saying, what is going on? It's that the pre-linguistic skills are really, really weak, and so you've got to strengthen that. So Let's Talk About Talking is your resource for that. That's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me for this podcast series. These last two shows were Expressive Language and Receptive Language Milestones by 18 months. The next two shows, we're bumping it up. We're moving on to 18 to 24 months. And if you thought that a language explosion with receptive language like we've had in this period was exciting, wait till we get to the language explosion with expressive language. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Laura Mize, pediatric speech language pathologist, and you've just listened to or watched Teach Me to Talk's podcast.